Welcome back for another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're digging into some really interesting source material. It's excerpts from a chapter called The Self in Action.
Right. And the focus is how this idea of the self from internal family systems isn't just theoretical. It actually changes things.
Yeah, how it shows up in life,
It-
internally, sure, but also externally, in relationships, how you engage with the world.
Exactly. How self-leadership translates into, well, action.
So, our mission here is to unpack that. We'll pull out the key insights, those really memorable examples from the source, and see what the practical impact looks like.
We'll touch on some interesting links like attachment theory.
Oh, right. And how this whole framework might shift how you even think about conflict or other people.
And there's some surprising elements too, maybe even things that feel a bit unexpected.
Intriguing. Okay, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So, self-leadership in action. Where does the source start connecting this to, everyday life?
Well, right off the bat, it makes this fascinating link between IFS and developmental psychology,
Yeah.
specifically attachment theory.
Attachment theory. How so?
The source describes IFS as kind of like taking attachment theory, but applying it inside.
Inside. Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, you know how attachment theory talks about kids needing good external attachment figures? Someone patient, calm, reassuring, a secure base.
Right, the good parent, essentially.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The source says that when people access their self in IFS, they just spontaneously seem to know how to offer those exact same qualities to their own internal parts.
Huh. Even if they never got that themselves.
Even if they had terrible parenting. It's like the self inherently has that capacity. It becomes a good attachment figure for your own vulnerable parts.
Wow. The self as the internal secure base.
Precisely. And the source points out a really key implication of this.
Which is?
When you become the primary caretaker of your own parts, as the source puts it.
You take the pressure off others.
Exactly. Your partner, your friends, your therapist,
Mm.
they don't have to carry that burden anymore. Because usually that's what happens, right?
Yeah, your parts are looking outside for someone to finally meet those needs.
Right. The exiles, the vulnerable ones, they look out, and their protectors often push for it too. They might put people on pedestals.
Yeah.
That's the positive transference.
Idealizing them.
Yeah. And then inevitably, the person falls short because who could live up to that? And then you get the backlash.
The negative transference, angry protectors stepping in.
Exactly. Blame, withdrawal, the whole cycle. But becoming self-led, meeting those needs inside first, can really interrupt that pattern.
And the source mentions this applies to parenting actual children, too.
Yes, absolutely. Parents who are more self-led tend to relate to their kids with those same self-qualities. Patience, clarity, calm, loving firmness. It flows from the internal to the external.
Okay, fascinating connection there. Now, the source also revisits this idea of the self having like a wave state.
Yeah, it contrasts the particle view of self, the leader, the conductor, with this wave state experience.
And what's that like?
More spaciousness, equanimity, sense of well-being, interconnectedness.
Interconnectedness. How does that translate into action?
Well, the source suggests that accessing that state fosters compassion. There's this feeling of they are us. You see the shared humanity more easily.
They are us. That's a powerful counterpoint to how we often view people we disagree with.
It really is. And the source contrasts it with what it calls totalizing others.
Totalizing.
Seeing them as just one thing, like utterly separate, a monomind, defined by a single label.
Like narcissist or racist or whatever the label might be, you just slap it on.
Exactly. You objectify them. And the consequence, the source argues, is you miss their complexity. You miss their other parts.
And you can't connect or act effectively.
Right. It just solidifies them into this negative box in your mind.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep your heart open, hard to figure out a constructive way forward.
The source uses a pretty charged example here, right? Like applying this lens to President Donald Trump.
It does. And it's really important we stress we're just reporting the perspective from the source material here, not making any political statement ourselves.
Understood. So how does the source use that example?
Well, the author reflects on how, protective parts might immediately want to label him, maybe put him in a diagnostic category.
Yeah, to totalize him.
Exactly. And if you were interacting from that place, maybe you'd try to shame him or argue in a certain way.
Which the source suggests would likely just bounce off. Or worse.
Probably. But the IFS perspective, as presented in the source, offers a different way. It's about trying to see the multiplicity.
Looking behind the powerful presentation.
Yeah. seeing the protectors that are maybe working overtime to keep him feeling safe or important, understanding they might be driven by exiles, carrying deep feelings of, say, worthlessness, maybe from childhood.
You see a whole system, not just a single entity.
Right. And the source frames this like good parenting. You can have compassion for the person, for the inner system, with its burdens and pain.
While still disagreeing strongly with or wanting to stop the actions of their protectors.
Exactly. You can hold both. Compassion for the internal struggle and firm boundaries or action regarding the external behavior and its impact.
That distinction feels crucial. It allows for nuance instead of just condemnation.
It really opens up possibilities for how to engage, whether it's personally or on a larger scale.
Speaking of larger scale, the source also talks about applying this self-led approach to social activism.
Yes, the author mentions working with activists and noticing a pattern. Often, people are drawn to activism precisely because they carry wounds, they carry exiles related to injustice.
Which makes sense. That fuels the passion.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And it leads to very strong, committed protectors fighting for change, which is vital.
But there's a but.
But the source notes, if the activism is primarily led by those protectors, without enough self-energy,
It can get messy.
it can sometimes end up creating more polarization, pushing potential allies away, or even, sadly, replicating some of the negative dynamics within the activist groups themselves.
Like power struggles, ego.
Exactly. Power grabs, bullying, rivalries. The source includes a really striking quote about this from Charles Eisenstein.
What does he say?
He basically asks, if our own organizations have the same bullying, the same power grabs we see everywhere else, how can we expect to create a different world if we win?
Oof. That's a challenging reflection for anyone trying to make change.
It is. And the source is honest, saying even institutions trying to be self-led, like the IFS Institute itself, are immune. They have blind spots reflecting the leader's burdened parts.
Yeah.
It's ongoing work for everyone.
Okay, this is all really laying the groundwork. Now, the source dives deep into a specific session to make this really concrete.
Yes, this is a major part of the chapter. A detailed look at a session with Ethan and Sarah Hughes.
And remind us who they are in the context of the source.
They're described as leaders in the sort of living off the grid movement. Very committed to a simple life, no electricity, no cars.
Right, deliberately living below the poverty line to avoid paying income tax, which they view as a war tax.
And they welcome lots of visitors, kind of modeling this different way of being, stepping away from the frantic pace.
So they're already exploring alternative ways of living. And in this session, they were new to actually doing IFS.
Had been learning about it, but this was one of their first times really working with it in this way.
And what was the main issue that came up for Ethan?
He talked about this really intense part he called the destroyer of injustice.
Destroyer of injustice. Sounds powerful.
Very. He said it would attack anything or anyone, including Sarah, that it saw as supporting, like white supremacy or classism. Very black and white.
Is there a specific example of how this played out between them?
Yeah, the trigger was Sarah wanting to build an addition onto their small house.
Yeah.
Ethan's part reacted fiercely, insisting they needed to live even smaller, pointing to homelessness. But the way it came out caused, as the source puts it, disharmony or far worse.
Far worse. That sounds serious. What was the impact on their relationship?
They'd actually almost split up about 2 years before because of conflicts like this. Before IFS, they'd mostly just avoided the topic, pulled back from it.
So the session started by exploring what happens inside each of them during these conflicts. What did Sarah describe?
Well, when Ethan's destroyer part flared up, she felt this surge of anger.
Yeah.
But she also had a silencer part that made it feel unsafe to express it.
So silent anger.
Yeah. And a part that would try to make her dissociate, just pull away or forget about it. And also her tender heart would feel clamped up, like in her throat. A whole constellation of responses.
And Ethan, seeing her shut down or pull away, what was going on for him?
He felt really sad. His destroyer part felt like it had no space, like it wasn't welcome. He'd worry Sarah was too tender, feel awful for hurting her.
Which would make him want to shut his part down.
Right. But then another part of him didn't want to shut it down because the message felt important. He called it a dance, sometimes a brawl inside him.
That internal conflict is so clear. Okay, so they started a repair process in the session. Ethan wanted to apologize.
Yes. The therapist guided them. Sarah was open. And as soon as Ethan started, he just began sobbing. He was encouraged to just stay with the sadness.
What came out as he stayed with it?
He talked about knowing how much Sarah loves the world, how deeply she feels things like he mentioned her crying for the monarch butterflies for the fish.
Ah.
And he realized his destroyer part in its fight for the world was actually hurting her, someone who loves the world just as much. He felt it was sacred, this connection they shared, and he'd been trying for years to figure it out.
How did Sarah react to hearing that?
She was really touched, especially hearing him acknowledge why he wanted to protect her, because he knew how much she loved everything. It helped her connect with the intention behind his destroyer part's actions.
So she could see the love driving it, even though the expression was painful?
Exactly. She even said that intensity, that commitment, was part of why she loved him, even though it was sometimes damaging.
That created an opening to work directly with his part then.
Yes. They decided to focus on Ethan's destroyer part. And a key piece was ensuring Sarah could stay present in her own self while he did his internal work. Her self-energy was important for the space.
Okay, so working with the destroyer, where did Ethan find this part?
He felt it in his chest. And when asked how he felt towards it, it was mixed gratitude but also fear.
Gratitude and fear. Okay.
So the therapist asked the afraid part if he could just step back a little, witness, and trust Ethan's self to lead. And it agreed.
Getting that permission. Crucial. Then what?
Then Ethan, from self, could start communicating directly with the destroyer, letting it know he valued its energy, its commitment, but wanted to find ways to use its power more effectively without pushing people away, expressing gratitude.
How did the destroyer respond to that?
It was skeptical at first,
Mm-hmm.
didn't quite trust him because it felt like it had been shut down or exiled so many times before.
Makes sense. Trust needs to be earned, even internally.
Absolutely, the source emphasizes that. So they explored what the part needed to feel safer, to trust Ethan more.
And what did it need?
Primarily, it needed to trust that Ethan was truly committed to real justice for all life and wouldn't just fall asleep or get complacent.
It needed to know Ethan wouldn't abandon the mission.
Right. And Ethan could honestly acknowledge that need and also acknowledge that, yes, he did have other parts that got scared or wanted to check out sometimes. He got why the destroyer felt it had to be so vigilant.
And then there was that moment where its deeper motivation came through.
Oh, yeah. Really powerful. The source describes Ethan saying the part started sobbing and expressed this deep knowing that Ethan loves the ocean. And it didn't want him to have to tell his daughters one day why there aren't any fish left.
Wow. Just profound grief and love fueling that protective intensity.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
connecting with that core love really shifted things. The part became more willing, even excited to work with Ethan, seeing possibilities, ripples of potential.
Though it still had its moments of impatience.
Slight chuckle.
Oh, yes.
The transcript has this great bit where the part suddenly throws up images and blurts out something like, "What the fuck are we doing? Let's go cook so the staff can come in and do this work."
Get on with the real action.
Totally. Classic protector urgency. Ethan also identified that this destroyer was protecting another part, one that was curled in a ball.
The exile. So they shifted focus to that part.
Yes. But the destroyer was hesitant. Remember the last time Ethan got close to that vulnerable part, he cried for a month. And the destroyer felt there's no room for crying when everything is dying. That urgency again.
Still trying to protect him from being overwhelmed by the grief.
Right. But the therapist reassured the part that this time it wouldn't be overwhelming, that healing the exile would actually help the whole system. The destroyer agreed to try, and other parts apparently seemed excited.
Okay, so turning towards the exile. The boy curled in a ball. Where did Ethan sense him?
Sort of in or around his body. And immediately, Ethan's self felt compassion. Just so sorry he has to come into a world like this.
What was the boy's reaction to that compassion?
He just looked up for a moment. Ethan was guided to just stay present, extend compassion from a distance, letting the boy feel his presence without pressure.
Building trust.
Exactly. Then the boy spoke. He said he can't go on without his dad.
Oh, man. Heartbreaking. How did Ethan respond?
He acknowledged the deep need for his dad. Then, checking it felt sincere from self, he offered, "I can be a dad to you." And the source says the boy stopped crying then. Ethan was able to move closer, kneel down, and hold him.
And being held probably opened the floodgates again.
It did. The boy cried more, and Ethan just held him, acknowledging the enormous amount of sadness he was carrying.
What did the boy say was the source of all that sadness? What did he need Ethan to understand?
He felt profoundly misunderstood. He couldn't make sense of the world, saying things like, "Why is everyone drinking and driving and killing people? It's so fucked up."
And this directly connects to his father's death.
Yes. Sarah confirmed in the session that Ethan's dad was killed by a drunk driver when Ethan was 13. This boy part was frozen in that time, carrying all that unprocessed trauma and confusion.
How else did that trauma affect him, according to the part?
He hated high school, said it felt like fucking prison. He felt alienated, like people only cared about superficial things like clothes at the mall, while he was grappling with this immense grief and injustice. Teachers didn't get it.
And there was also that layer of guilt he carried.
Yeah, tragically, he felt partly responsible.
Why? How did he figure that?
His dad had asked him to go to a basketball game with him, apparently for the first time. But Ethan chose to go to an arcade instead, feeling he got caught up in the culture.
So the connection he made was...
Superficiality kills. That terrible, illogical leap a traumatized kid might make. And that belief had fueled his intense anti-superficiality, his destroyer part, ever since.
So Ethan, from self, needed to tell him it wasn't his fault.
Yes. Staying with him, letting him know that truth. The boy's first reaction was actually to apologize for being superficial, showing how deep that guilt went. But eventually he nodded. He felt Ethan finally understood.
The next step, then, was bringing Ethan's adult self back into that past scene.
Right. To be with the 13-year-old boy in the way he needed someone back then. There was a brief check-in with a watching part, asking it to let self be fully present.
And then?
Ethan was there, crying with the boy, holding his feet. The boy knew he was there, felt his presence, and was glad.
What did the boy need most in that moment back then?
Just to be held. He didn't want to be alone. He asked about his mom, the neighbors. Ethan explained why they perhaps couldn't be fully there for him, and crucially told the boy, "You should have had somebody, you deserve to, and you have me now."
And that made a difference.
Yeah. The source says the boy smiled for the first time.
Okay, so retrieval and unburdening. Where did the boy want to go to feel safe and healed?
He wanted to swim in the ocean. But specifically, the ocean as it used to be, full of life, turtles, dolphins, seaweed, vibrant.
So they created that image. And was he ready to let go of the burdens?
He was. He felt them in the back of his head, his heart, his stomach. He wanted to give the feelings and beliefs to the ocean. He kept the memories, using an image of a canoe for those, but pushed the heavy stuff away.
Did he feel different afterwards?
Lighter, smiling, floating, but still some sadness remained. He chose to let that go too, into the ocean.
And it's after this unburdening that something unusual happened.
Yes. This is where the source highlights what it calls the spiritual aspects. The boy said he wanted his dad.
And Ethan,
Guided by the therapist and checking it felt right from self, Ethan invited his dad's spirit to be there. And the transcript says, he's here.
his father's spirit appeared in the inner landscape.
That's how it's described. The dad had something to say. The boy had questions. The boy asked if letting go of the sadness meant losing the connection.
And the father's spirit replied,
I'm right here all the time.
Oh, wow. How did the boy respond to that?
He climbed into a rowboat with his dad in the scene, just sobbing, being held.
And Ethan was part of this.
Yes, the boy called Ethan over. So Ethan joined them, holding the boy while the dad watched, smiling. A really profound image of healing.
After that intense healing, they brought the protectors back in.
Yeah, invited the original destroyer and any other parts to come see the boy now in his healed state.
What was their reaction?
More parts showed up. They were happy. One was even dancing. The destroyer was there too, arms crossed, but smiling and nodding. Still, Ethan noted, a little impatient.
Still got places to be. And the destroyer itself still had some work to do.
Right. It hadn't unburdened yet. Ethan asked if it wanted to let go of any burdens it carried that weren't truly its to carry.
And what was its burden?
That protecting life is up to him. This immense, solitary weight carried in his neck and back.
Where did it choose to release that burden?
Ethan saw an image of a huge mountain, like half mountain, half woman, a kind of mountain goddess. The destroyer knelt and put the burden down before her like sacred sword, checked with her, got a nonverbal yes.
And how did it feel without that sword, that burden?
Lighter. But it immediately asked for a purpose. It needed a positive role.
And it received one.
The mountain goddess figure gave it a ball of light. Purpose. The destroyer held it, started glowing, smiling. Didn't want it to stop.
What a transformation for that part.
Truly. At this point, Ethan felt the internal work was complete for the session, but he wanted to reconnect with Sarah.
How did they do that?
He was still sobbing, processing everything, and invited her to sit on his lap. She came over, sat with him, stroked his head. Just presence and connection.
That session transcript is incredibly detailed and powerful. But the source includes some really important warnings or caveats around it.
Yes, very crucial. The author stresses, this is not typical of every session. It flowed exceptionally well.
Why did it flow so well?
Ethan and Sarah had advantages. They had already been thinking about IFS. They took responsibility. Ethan had good access to self. His parts trusted him enough to allow the process.
So it's not a blueprint for DIY therapy.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The author explicitly warns against trying to access deep exiles like this without skilled help. It's shared to show what's possible, to illustrate the model.
It also shows how IFS can work in couples therapy, right?
Definitely. You see how working deeply with one partner's parts shifts the whole dynamic. The source notes that in ongoing work, they'd likely focus on Sarah's parts next.
And it clearly demonstrates the steps involved in protector work and exile healing.
Yeah, getting permission, honoring the part, reassuring it, then for the exile. Building trust, witnessing the story, retrieving from the past, unburdening and integrating with the protectors.
Now back to those spiritual aspects, the dad spirit, the mountain goddess. How does the author frame these?
They describe their approach as being both an empiricist and a pragmatist.
Meaning?
Empiricists just observe and study the phenomena that arise without preconceived notions, even if it doesn't fit neatly into existing boxes. Follow the data. Pragmatist, if it helps the client heal profoundly, then work with it. Don't get hung up on exactly what it is.
So focus on the healing impact.
Exactly. Because these experiences, whatever their ultimate nature, seem to be incredibly healing for people.
And this isn't just for people who already have spiritual beliefs.
No, the source mentions these things can pop up spontaneously even for atheists or people whose beliefs might seem to contradict it. Sometimes it even causes confusion or anger at first.
And the author raises a pretty big question about this.
Yeah, wondering if this kind of focused inner work with parts might be tapping into a similar realm or capacity that, say, shamanic traditions access through different methods, drumming, chanting, altered states.
A possible link between deep psychological work and other ways of knowing or experiencing reality.
It opens up that possibility, yeah.
Okay, so stepping back from the specifics of that session, let's generalize. What happens to a protector like Ethan's destroyer once it's healed and unburdened? What's the ideal outcome?
It doesn't feel so compelled to take over in extreme ways. It learns to trust the self to lead effectively. It might take on more of an advisory role, offering its wisdom and passion, but relying on self's qualities for expression.
It keeps the passion, the core energy.
Yes, the love for justice, the protective instinct that's valuable energy. But it's channeled through self now.
And the source mentions the specific qualities of self that enable this.
Right. The 8 C's, calm, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, connection, clarity. And this source also highlights 5 Ps.
5 Ps.
Persistence, persistence, presence, perspective, and playfulness.
Playfulness. Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do people draw on these C's and P's in challenging situations?
Well, for example, self-led activists might have more patient persistence because self offers a longer-range perspective. They can be forceful when needed, but without escalating conflict unnecessarily because they have presence. They can use compassion to see past an opponent's attacks to their underlying vulnerability.
So the goal in conflict isn't just to win or even change the other person immediately.
Right. The source emphasizes that a key goal becomes maintaining your own self-leadership, staying connected to yourself, regardless of how the other person is acting, reinforcing that internal stability.
And for protectors to really buy into this, they need to see that self isn't just passive or weak.
Exactly. Often protectors look down on self, see it as mushy or naive, especially if they've only known self when it's blended with scared parts. They need experiences where they see self can actually stand firm, set boundaries, guide the system safely. They learn they don't have to do it all alone.
The source has that dramatic riptide story to illustrate self showing up even in real physical danger.
Yeah, it's quite a story. The author gets caught in a strong riptide, pulled out, fighting exhaustion, genuinely thinking this might be it.
Panic stations internally.
Totally. Parts screaming, we're going to die.
Yeah.
But somehow, enough self was present to acknowledge them, to be with them in the fear, to say internally, we might die, but I'm here with you.
And that made a difference.
He felt them calm down, just slightly. And in that tiny bit of inner space, he was able to see his sister-in-law signaling frantically from the beach and follow her counterintuitive advice to swim sideways parallel to the shore, which saved him.
Wow. A literal life or death example of self making a difference.
The point being, even in extreme danger, it's possible to hold parts to access some self. It takes practice. Parts need to trust self, but any amount helps. It's always better to face challenges from relative calm and clarity than from sheer panic or dissociation.
So that feels very relevant to navigating crises generally.
Absolutely. Applying self helps lessons be learned at all levels.
And finally, let's circle back to Ethan's reflection after his session. How did he describe the change?
He talked about having much greater spaciousness around the issues he cared about. The fire for justice was still there, absolutely, but it felt different.
How so?
He said it felt shared with others instead of burning against others. He beautifully described it as shifting from power over to power with.
Power over to power with. That really sums up the shift from a burdened protector to a self-led energy.
It does. He felt more open, less rigid, better able to navigate complex situations. He used this metaphor before. His energy felt like being in a small hot room that burned people who got close. Afterwards, it felt like an inviting campfire outside, where people could gather, choose how close they wanted to be.
That's a wonderful image, and this shift actually attracted new opportunities.
Yeah, he called the new energy joyful power with, and felt it opened doors for him to collaborate in new ways, like working with Indigenous women and supporting the queer and trans community.
It really shows how the internal transformation ripples outwards into the world.
A perfect illustration of the self in action.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the core takeaways for you, the listener? We've journeyed through this idea of self-leadership acting like an internal, secure parent, transforming how you relate to yourself and others.
Yeah, changing external engagement from reactivity to ideally more presence and compassion. We saw the steps of healing, witnessing exile pain, retrieving parts, unburdening beliefs and emotions, integrating protectors, all brought to life through Ethan and Sarah's story.
And we touched on those surprising elements like the appearance of spiritual figures or guides in the work, and how the source suggests approaching them pragmatically, focusing on the healing they bring.
Ultimately, it's about using this knowledge, this framework, to better navigate your own inner landscape, and from there, the challenges and complexities of the outer world with hopefully more of those self-qualities, courage, clarity, compassion, persistence.
So, as a final thought to leave you with, drawing from the source material, how does really considering this complex inner world, the protectors fighting for you, the exiles holding pain, the potential for self to guide her, how does that shift the way you view conflict? Maybe conflict within yourself, between your own parts, or conflict with others?
And perhaps, what does it mean to just stay curious about the possibility that this kind of deep inner exploration might connect us to unexpected resources, maybe even realms beyond our usual understanding, whether you interpret that symbolically or literally, something to ponder.